A few thoughts today on this homecoming Sunday around the sermon title, Settled Nomads. Settled Nomads. Now, the thinking around this sermon title was emerging from the mists, the fogginess of my subconscious. And it presented itself on paper or electronically when I sent it to Wendy before it had time to create space for itself and to claim standing in such a manner that it could be harnessed and put in order and fine ordered lines so that it can become a sermon. But I think the thinking underpinning this and the emerging of the sermon title had validity to it, and it was sound what I was trying to form in my mind to try and present to you in the form of a sermon today. The question can be asked, rightfully so, what a settled nomad is, because it seems to be contradictory. Nomadic existence and settled existence normally would contradict each other. However, I was thinking about it, and I think a nomad, a settled nomad, is not necessarily a has-been nomad that now sits on a nice couch with a cocktail and satin sheets and, contemplate the glorious past that he recalls that never really was. Or a settled nomad is not somebody that never really was a nomad, but just adopted that identity while having a settled and comfortable existence, like most of the people on the face of the earth have today. I think a nomad in its nomadic existence always has one component or an important aspect of his existence that is settled. I think even though the nomad is normally as free as the wind that he or she can feel on the face, but also grounded at the same time. Grounded by a way of being in the world, a framework for living, a value system, if you want, a code of ethics, if you want, that was shaped and formed by the beauty of nature that always or most often surrounds the nomad, and that had a very profound influence on the system of grounding and providing security and a settledness. The nomad can ignore this value system or this framework as at his or her own peril. I want to briefly on this homecoming Sunday touch on a few characteristics that I think that is part or that is descriptive of a nomadic existence. And the first is that I think a nomadic existence is characterized by honesty and by integrity in that existence. Honesty and integrity, because there simply normally is not the resources. The resources are not there for a life that consists of living behind a facade, or putting up a facade, or putting up a veil, or living a life of pretense or pretending. It is normally life stripped of such luxuries. And it leads to a life normally focused on essentials and what is important. Setting priorities comes naturally in the setting of the nomad. An existence of honesty, of integrity. The second characteristic I want to pause for a moment to highlight, and there are many more that one can dwell on, but the second one I want to quickly touch on is there is freedom in this existence. Because in a nomadic existence, the nomad is forced by nature to recognize, to acknowledge, to accept, and to make peace with his or her own mortality. Knowing that we are passing through, and the days that we are granted in this life, those days is like a fleeting moment. And going along with this acceptance of our own mortality, of the nomad's own mortality, is also acknowledgement of the vulnerability of the nomad's existence. Knowing that no matter how much experience you have, no matter how long you've lived, no matter how intelligent you are, there is always, to a degree, a powerlessness against nature and circumstance. And therefore, greeting a new day is most often in the life of the nomad a moment of gratitude, because the knowledge and the realization is there that greeting a new day is a privilege and it is not a given. The moments of experiencing that vulnerability are therefore many or constant. There is no buffer to shield the nomad from the reality within which he or she finds himself. And if there is a buffer created for a while, it is usually quite thin and very temporary in existence. The third characteristic I want to dwell on very quickly is the suppleness or the flexibility of a nomadic existence. The nomad learns experientially that it is required for survival to be flexible. Flexible in the moment, in the very short term, in the now, but also looking towards the future. With these characteristics, the nomad, I think, having acquired this framework that is security, this framework that guides his or her life, is that knowledge and the willing embrace of the sacred bond between the members of the group of nomads. There is a realization and there is that firm knowledge present in every moment of their existence, either on the forefront or perhaps in the background, but there is that realization that we are interdependent and that without the other, there is no existence. Because we are vulnerable, because we are mortals. And no matter how flexible we are as individuals, there is this realization that survival is a collective enterprise, that we are in this together. There is this realization that this interconnectedness is part of the web of relationships that sustain that individual and that individual nomad. And what's interesting when you look at nomadic cultures and groups, there is not only a realization that we need to be in this together with a huge sense of reciprocity and responsibility towards the group, but there is this firm realization that we have to be together also thinking about the generations that will follow us, which implies and dictates that the existence now should be such that it is sustainable for those members that will come forth from this nomadic group. And now on this historic homecoming day, historic in a number of ways, I want to invite you and I want to ask you and I want to plead with you to be like those settled nomads as a covenanted community. In our tradition that we're part of, the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, and in our sacred text, we find the story to a large extent reflecting that of a nomadic people, Israel. And the Exodus story is one of the main themes in that sacred text. The story of going into exile and returning. And we find some of that reflected in what Rob read to us, the selection of the verses from Psalm 90, a psalm that is popular to be used at funerals or memorials, where it speaks about the mortality of man and the fleeting existence like grass that is green and flourishes in the morning and then withers in the evening. It is a beautiful poem of an intimate relationship of this author's existence, experiencing that as being in the presence of God. It is a cry for acknowledging that life has been hard, circumstances has been harsh, and a longing for wisdom to be garnered from that, gathered from that for the future, to be able to live in such a way that God will look favorably on the author's existence and grant this individual days of joy and celebration, experiencing what is good, and a longing for the wisdom to live in such a way that the prayer of the last few verses can be prayed with conviction. What we do, our endeavors, may they become something that have lasting value. In the passage from the Gospel according to Mark, we find a description of the way that Jesus was in the world as a nomad, an itinerant teacher that traveled from place to place. And it is right in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark here, put out there again. I have to go to preach the message to other towns in Galilee. That is my mission. And this itinerant teacher was familiar with hardship, was familiar with vulnerability. His own vulnerability because of the forces that he opposed. The mighty Roman Empire, the Jewish establishment, the religious establishment specifically. And he was also familiar with the vulnerability of those that followed him and listened to his message. But he brought a message of hope to those that listened to him, those that journeyed with him, and that found value and grounding in what he said and what he lived. These words come to us in very specific circumstances. It comes to us as people living in and, I hope, through a pandemic. We've been in this for a few months now, and it was old after about a month, I think, for most of us. It comes to us as people that is part of the nation that on Friday relived the horror of the 9/11 attacks and had the opportunity again to contemplate, if we are wise and responsible, the consequences of our response to the attack as well. It comes to us as people who are beginning to experience and see the curtain being lifted on the consequences of climate change, as we see the horrors playing out in several West Coast states. Death and destruction on a scale that is unimaginable. These words come to us as well as people living in an environment where partisanship often reach levels that is not beneficial, that is harmful, that sometimes and increasingly frequently leads to death. It comes to us as church as well. And I said previously, I'm trying to get my head around this pandemic, what it does to individuals, what it does to communities, to societies. And I read recently an analysis by a Methodist church leader who was posting on a forum, invited to post there, and that started out with the question, will the church survive the pandemic? And this wise, brilliant scholar and leader's response was probably not. He thinks the church will not survive, and he said, the model that the church has for its existence is not sustainable, and the pandemic has brought that to the fore. And this leader continues to pose the next question: are the clergy ready to quit? Because he said, because of the increased workload, the additional stress, the bleak prospects for the future of the church has brought many clergy to the point where they say enough is enough. Now, to put, before you celebrate or before you get worried, either of the two, I don't have any intentions of quitting, and I don't think Amy either. So you'll have to put up with us for a while. But these are the circumstances that we find ourselves in as vulnerable people, that the pandemic has also brought to us. And our mortality that the pandemic has also put right in front of us, that the natural disasters like the more intense hurricanes and the fires and the violence that we see in many places also brought to us. And I've written in my few words in the newsletter that I'm encouraged by what I experience and observe in our covenant community, our little nomadic band, our group of people. I observe and experience a resilience. If I look at the number of people that logged on this morning, I can say, yeah, that testifies to it, that people are sticking it out. The pledge contributions continue to be positive, and there's a lot of activity, many things going on. As I said in the piece in the newsletter, we are not just hanging on, we are being church that still is able not only to take care of ourselves, but to focus on our mission. And I want to call on you as a covenant community to adopt and embrace the characteristics of the nomadic existence, grounded in the law of love, grounded in the ways of compassion, grounded in God's guidance for us, but embracing also opportunities for the future with a flexibility that is more demanding and for which there is a greater need now than in the past. And I also want to ask you to embrace that characteristic of honesty, of integrity, to commit anew, to get congruence, to get agreement between what we profess and what we do. In this nomadic existence, as we go forward, let us also heed the lessons of the nomadic existence that is part of what makes it possible to continue and to flourish. And that is that strong sense of realization that we are in this together, that we exist within a web of relationships. And going into the future, accepting our vulnerability and our own mortality, let us make this our sacred duty. Instead of the pandemic driving us into smaller units, into more isolation, because it is tempting once you've settled into this and you're comfortable behind the screen and you can do your own fire pit, you can keep yourself busy, you can visit your grandchildren or your children or family or a few friends that you socially distance, mingle with. It is easy to let go of the community that has this special mission and this special calling. And therefore, let us continue to increasingly reach out and take care of one another. Make a special effort to take care of those that you know that are going through difficult times. Make a special effort to take care of those that you know that live alone, that do not have family around, that are not able perhaps to see their grandchildren, and make a special effort to be there for your brother and sister in Christ who you know may experience health problems or live with uncertainty about the result of a biopsy, or have a long wait to see, for instance, if cancer is returning. Let us be God's nomads, aware of and acknowledging our existence, which is a vulnerable existence, aware of our own mortality, but embracing life in its fullness, and embracing each other in such a way that this community continues through the pandemic, and especially thereafter, to be a community of hope. Let us come home to that existence and that way of being in the world, in the example of the nomad we learned about and read about again today in the Gospel according to Mark. May it be so. Welcome home.